Hello, Booktopians, and welcome to this very special live event where we're talking with crime writer Emma Viskic about writing crime novels and about her work and how she got published. So, Emma, thank you so much for your time and welcome to the Booktopia Facebook page.
Thanks so much for having me along. I'm really looking forward to chatting.
So let's get right into it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey from first deciding to sit down and write and publication? And for those of you playing along at home, Emma is the author of such books as Resurrection Bay and Fire Came Down and Darkness for Light, which is your latest novel, which was out in November last year, I believe.
December, yeah.
December, yeah. Cool.
Yeah. So yeah, all part of the same series. So I had quite a circuitous route to be being published. I first started writing when I first started reading. So I've been writing all my life. I wrote, a rip-off of anything I was reading. Greek myths, bad John le Carre with, terrible fake English dialogue, all of that stuff. But along the way, I sort of made the decision that my second love, which was music, was actually going to be a career path. So I became a professional clarinet player, classical clarinet player. Um, uh, Quite a few similarities between music and writing, including enjoying being by myself in a small room, practicing quite a lot. When I'd been playing professionally for 15, 20 years or something. I was really, really missing writing. I was still doing, but not consistently. So I thought, oh, I think I should sit down and write a book. So I wrote my first full length manuscript. Took me about a year to do. I wrote one draft of it, and I thought I was very clever, very special. And then I read it and realized that I had a long, long, long way to go. But I'd enjoyed the process so much. I really enjoyed being in a world that I thought, well, here's where the actual practice begins. So I wrote another full length manuscript. I didn't send that first one off to anyone. I didn't show it to anyone. It was just something I did. And by the time I got to the end of the second manuscript, I felt ready to then write what was to become my debut novel, Resurrection Bay. So I'd had this quite long process of just practicing writing, basically. That was my way of doing my own masterclasses, really, just reading and writing. And then Resurrection Bay, funnily enough, it was acquired. I didn't send it out. My publisher, Echo Publishing, actually asked me if they could have a look at it because I'd won a couple of short story competitions and they knew I was working on it. And we'll probably go through that little how the actual publishing story worked a little bit later, the mechanics of that. And so, yeah, the next thing I knew, Resurrection Bay was published and I was an author. And even though it had taken decades to get there, it did feel like it happened overnight at the end of it. So it depends which way you look at it. It took forever or it happened quickly.
So for anybody who's looking for advice, step one, become a professional clarinet player.
It actually does help quite a lot.
So next question, where do you start when you're crafting a novel? What's kind of day one?
Usually I have a scene, at least one scene in mind, because at the moment I'm writing a series. It's Caleb Zellick is the protagonist. So I have the protagonist in mind. If I was starting anew, so when I first started writing Resurrection Bay, I actually started with him as the character. But now I have him and I have the world. I need to start with a scene or maybe two or three scenes and they feel that they're important. I don't often know why they've occurred. I don't know what's going to happen afterwards, but I know I'm writing towards them. So with Resurrection Bay, I had Caleb as a character and I actually had the opening scene, although it wasn't the opening scene of the novel at that stage. I had a man sitting in a suburban kitchen cradling his best mate who has been killed. And I just went, oh, who are these people? Is Caleb a good guy or a bad guy? How did his friend get killed? And I wrote from there. So for me, very much the scene, and funnily enough, often the season as well, because it helps me create the world. So with And Fire Came Down, which is the second book, I had a lot of trouble getting into the story until I knew that it was in the middle of a heat wave. And it was going to be in the small town and it was going to be very claustrophobic. So sometimes those bigger things can help get me into the story when I first started.
So you mentioned that you kind of started with Caleb. How much of a sense of who he was did you have at the very beginning? Or did he come to you kind of fully formed, or was there a lot of evolution in kind of getting him onto the page?
Yeah, both, funnily enough. I had his essence down. I knew that he was going to be a very, very stubborn character, that he was going to be an outsider. And along the way, I also discovered, decided, found out that he was profoundly deaf. And at that moment of the writing, his character just all came together. Um, and it's one of those funny things with writing. Often you don't know why you're writing things until quite a long time afterwards. Sometimes a very smart person will tell you, and you'll go, "No, that's not true," and then you realize it is true. Um, I think I've been writing towards Caleb's character since my very early primary school writing. Um, it's partly to do with the fact that I went to school with a profoundly deaf girl, um, but more to do with the fact perhaps that my grandparents, my only grandparents that I have, didn't speak English. They were Croatian immigrants. I wasn't raised to speak Croatian. So I've been writing characters who were blind, who were invisible, who were mute, all the way through my childhood. We write instead of do therapy. um, so once that all sort of came together in Caleb's character, I absolutely knew how he would react in most situations. But the nuance only came after writing for many, many, many hours and writing many scenes. I'd often know that something wasn't working, but I didn't know why until I'd sort of lived with him in my head for months, years, really.
Are you sick of him yet?
No, no, not at all. Not at all. I get quite cross with him sometimes. No,
Yeah.
I'm loving it. I was really, really keen to write a really tight, short series. So it's going to be 4 books. I might come back and revisit, with a jump in time, but I could sort of see this emotional arc. And I was actually feeling really sad about finishing because I'm writing the 4th in the series at the moment. I was thinking, oh, it'll be really lovely to write something new, but I'm going to feel a bit sad. And then I thought, well, like I can come back and revisit. There's no laws, so
Yeah.
yeah. Strangely enough, I'm not sick of him yet.
I also just wanted to address our audience very quickly and just say that if anybody has any questions that they have for Emma, please feel free to write them in the comments, and we'll get to them at the end of the chat. So research. Obviously, you have to do a lot when you're writing something like a novel set in a police kind of world. Where do you start with your research? At what point does it kind of come in?
So I guess there's 2 different levels of research. There's the crime fiction element of it, where you need to be not jerking the reader out of a story by having police do things that they wouldn't do, or at least without explanation. So for me, with that sort of thing, I try and do that research actually quite late in the story. I think for 2 reasons. One is that it's very easy to avoid your manuscript. So the little rabbit hole of research you can spend a whole day researching a minor point that actually doesn't end up being in the book. So what I try and do is write what feels right, and then I'll go and do the research then. Just a little thing that I did with And Fire Came Down. It's set in quite a small town. And I just wanted to check that I was right on who the most senior police officer would be in the town and how many police cars. So I rang the police station of a town in Victoria with a similar number of a similar population and just check those facts. So those little facts you sort of just do once you've got that in place. The other side of research is, for me, is quite specific to my books, which is researching the deaf side of things. So it's not something you generally have to do when you write a novel, but if you're writing from outside your own experience, you absolutely have to. And research is probably almost, I feel a bit like it's a bit of a clinical word when it comes to writing, looking into people and how people live. So that was an entirely different process, and it's still ongoing. I mean, I'm still learning stuff now. So that started with talking to people who were deaf and hard of hearing, reading lots of books and memoirs. But then I did, and again, a little bit later in the writing process, because I wanted to get Caleb how I thought it would be first. Then I did an online lip reading course. Thought I was incredibly clever again. Put earbuds in my ears and went out and tried to order coffees and catch public transport and ask for directions, and failed miserably, and found out how hard lip reading is. It's incredibly difficult. And then I actually was thinking that he might use Auslan, Australian Sign Language. So I thought, well, the very first step is I need to do at least a short course to see if this will happen. And within 5 minutes, I knew he was going to be a signer as well. So then I actually ended up doing a TAFE course in Auslan, and I've just a couple of weeks ago gone back and started another course. So it's that ongoing thing. I often think of Donald Rumsfeld in these, as you do. It's the unknown unknowns. You don't know what you don't know until you get into it. So it depends. Is it important for you to know it? Is it important for me to know the colour of the gun? It's actually not, because I don't have a police detective. Is it important for me to know how the deaf community works? Yeah, that's really important. So it's a real, it's a constant learning process, really.
Yeah. Do you research place as well?
Yeah, in a funny way. I don't write real places, except for I do drop in real places in Melbourne because they're just places I know. Um, the town that I have, Resurrection Bay, is made up. It's based on many real places I know, but it's its own place. So I don't tend to, yeah, go to a real place and say I'll use this. But I do like to travel in the sort of imaginary areas. So there's this Resurrection Bay is imaginary, but it's down on the west coast of Australia. So I do spend a lot of time down there. I've also got family, so it works out really well. But it's not for the specifics. It's more for the mood and the general feel of things.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about Caleb and the choices that you have him make, and I guess any character that you're writing. Often you have to put them in the position where they have to make a choice that maybe frustrates the audience or makes the audience go, no, why are you doing that? How do you make these kinds of decisions?
I've actually had quite a few people say that reading the books can be an interactive experience where they go, stop it, don't do that. Which is great. I love it that it's interactive. I think it really comes down to knowing your character really well. And you will know, even as a beginner writer, you will know when you are forcing a character to do something. And even now, occasionally, I try and make Caleb do something that would really be quite convenient for me, plot-wise. And I think, yes, I'd really like you to make this choice, but you just know in your gut that it is completely wrong for the character. Or even it's just a bit of a bum note. So you've got to write away from that. So once you know the character and know that they will make what really to you is a daft decision, it's actually a really easy one to make as a writer, because it actually comes down to the book in the end and it feels right. And so you just go with it. Just embrace it. It can be a bit mean sometimes.
I feel like there's probably a fairly fine line, because you often you often read a book, or watch a movie for that matter, and it always stands out when the characters make dumb decisions, as opposed to kind of the frustrating ones where they're doing something in character, but when they're making those dumb decisions that are clearly just to serve the plot or out of character. And I feel like when you're writing, it can be a very fine line to kind of skate when you're making these calls. Do you give much thought to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I don't want you to see my fingerprints on things. I just want you to see Caleb making a good decision. I absolutely agree. Like if you're watching a film and somebody comes home by themselves in the middle of the night and there's an axe murderer in the loose and they walk into the house by the you're going, that is just stupid. I mean, it might be handy for the writers, and it's worse, I think, when you're reading a book because you are so immersed in the world that those sort of decisions that don't feel right feel like a betrayal. So I think you have a contract with the reader and with the character to be really sloppy, for it to be honest, and to be doing the right thing. So yeah, I absolutely think about that every step of the way.
When it comes to these moments, does Caleb ever surprise you when you're writing and he does
Yeah.
something that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, yeah, he absolutely does. So when I get stuck or when I don't know what's going to happen next, I usually get two characters in a room talking. So that's always Caleb and someone else because it's all from his perspective. And I just get them chatting for a few pages. None of that makes it onto the final page, and they'll chat away. And almost without fail, one of them will say or do something surprising. And I go, thank you very much. And I know I am aware of it enough to know that that is my subconscious. But it is a really nice way of getting into things and taking yourself by surprise. I guess it is what it is.
So, how much of these conversations do you have kind of written down and unpublished? Is it like a manuscript's worth, or?
Oh, more than. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, more. Yeah. So I'm quite a sparse writer, so my books, word count wise, are quite short. And for every book, I would have at least double that in saved
wow.
somewhere. We don't delete; we send them to the farm with the other words.
Yeah.
Keep.
When you're writing books like this, you always have to put your characters through some difficult times. You're constantly challenging them, maybe to the point of hurting them. How do you decide how far to go when you're putting your character through their paces like that?
What's right for the book and what's right for the character, I think, in the end. I had quite a hard decision when I was writing Resurrection Bay. Firstly, because it was my first book, but I do something at the end of it that's quite violent, and I did think about it and rethink, and I really agonized, but there's an absolute reason for it. And the reason is that, without any spoilers, as I said, Caleb is an incredibly stubborn character. So something massive has to happen for him to make the choice that he makes. So that was a really interesting one. And I went back and forth on it for ages, until I realized I was just being squeamish and didn't want to do it for the wrong reasons. And once I made that decision and realized it was the only thing that was right for the book, for the character, for the plot, it was very easy to inflict quite a lot of trauma.
Yeah, there are sometimes you read a book and or I do at least, and I'm like, why didn't you kill that character? Because clearly, I think some authors get really attached and pull their punches at the last minute.
Yeah, Lee Childs talks about that a lot because, of course, he's written, what, 24, 25 Jack Reacher books. He said you can tell when a writer gets too fond of their character because that's when they start being too nice to them. And he said that a number of years ago, and I've been thinking about it ever since. It's like, yeah, okay, just when you're getting a bit too fond, got to do something bad.
yeah. So while we're talking about character, how would you say that you craft a compelling character?
um, I think a lot of it comes down to empathy, really. Um, Anytime you get a character in a book and try and describe them in a few lines, it can feel a bit clunky. So you get a character and say, oh, it's a young woman and she does Tai Chi with swords and beheads ex-boyfriends. And you sort of go, that sounds off. But if you write that character so you absolutely understand her and understand her motivations and you are in her head, then it becomes a person. So it's very much for my characters, and it's it's not just my protagonist, my secondary characters. When I'm writing their scenes, when at the stage when I'm really polishing them, not first draft territory, I'm actually in their heads as well when I'm writing them. So I do it from Kayla's perspective, and then I do it from their perspective, and check that their reactions and their dialogue and all this stuff is actually coming from them, because every character is the hero in their own story. We're just seeing them for a short amount of time.
Mhm.
Um, I'm sure other people have other techniques, but I'm very much a gut instinct sort of writer. So I do a lot of um, careful academic, almost, thinking at the end, but in the beginning stages, just like, does it feel right?
Mhm.
Uh, so that's how, and that's just writing a lot, just writing and writing and writing these characters. They don't sort of walk onto the page usually fully formed. And I guess also that little dialogue technique that I use, getting the characters talking, that's also a way for me to get inside their heads.
Mm. Do you plan a lot when you're plotting out the story and the characters, or do you kind of just go with your gut the first time and then, you know?
Yeah. Oh, I wish I planned. I really do. I've tried so hard to plan. It just looks so much more efficient. I don't want to plan the whole novel because that would kill it for me. I'd like to plan a bit more. But when I've done that, I've written towards a plan a bit, and it's just been lifeless. There's just been no blood going to it at all. So I end up chucking it out. So I very much just start with a few scenes and go from there. I mean, I'm constantly thinking about plot though the entire time I'm writing. So the Caleb books take about 2 years for me to write, and I am plotting and retro engineering the entire time. So it would be great if I could start off with a plan and just go, yeah, this is what's going to happen. Most people who do plan don't plan the whole thing out. Some people do. Um, and there is some movement as well, I think, for people who plan it, but it would be good just to get a little bit of that. But you do what you do.
Hmm. I think it's a personal theory of mine, but I think sometimes you can tell the authors who plan like really, really, really well and kind of have the ending in mind and write towards it, and then you read those authors sometimes where they have these really, really, really long books that go on and on and on and on and on, and then you're like, you didn't actually work out ever how to end it.
It is always such a relief to me when I know what the ending's going to be. And sometimes I actually start with the ending, and sometimes I don't know until I've been writing for months, and it's just like a moment of, that's what this whole book's about. The whole book's always about the ending, not the beginning. Uh,
Yeah,
so yeah, it's an important one, definitely.
yeah. So I think that's interesting. What you said. You have the idea of the ending in mind, but you don't necessarily know that it is the ending until you're kind of in the writing process. Is that what you mean?
No, I know it's the ending, but I don't always know it. I know it at different times. I come to I, I am aware of it at different times in the writing process. So I'll go, oh, this is how it's going to end. And sometimes I begin the book knowing that, but sometimes it takes a long time for me to know what the ending's going to be. And it's fantastic if I know it at the beginning of the process because it makes it so much easier.
Yeah. So you're writing a detective, and obviously there are genre tropes and conventions and ideas that go along with detective stories. Uh, what's your approach to these? Do you play with them? Do you like to subvert expectations, or does it just kind of come out organically?
I'm all about subverting expectations. Absolutely. So with Caleb, okay, so the standard gumshoe detective, because he's a amateur detective, is the straight white man who drinks a lot and sleeps around a lot. And I thought, well, he's a straight white man, but he's vulnerable because of his deafness. So that's my first switch. And the other one, he's actually quite uptight about drugs and drinking, which makes sense for his character. His brother, who is a heroin addict. So there's real clashes there with it's a weakness. No, it's not a weakness. Thinking about all these things, and he obviously changes as the books go on. Um, And so instead, he's addicted to running. So he runs a lot. So I really enjoy playing with those different things. His business partner, Frankie, is not a sexy young blonde. She's a woman in her late 50s who's really quite incredibly cranky and swears a lot. So taking what is perhaps just getting a bit boring after book after book after book of seeing those standard tropes, to switch them up a bit, is really I like as a reader as well as a writer.
Yeah, it's nice to have an element of surprise and unpredictability.
Mm. And it makes it feel like real life.
Yeah. Can you take us through a day in the life of Emma Viskic when you're working on a novel?
So I'm always working on a novel.
Well, I mean, like when you're like when you're
Yeah,
when you're really in the writing process,
yeah,
you've
yeah,
got your deadline, and
yeah. So every day is a little bit different. But if I have a whole day to work, I will, if I'm working at home, I will basically have a cup of coffee and start work by about 8. And if I'm at the later stages of books, so that means once the plot is all down, once I've gone back and retro engineered all the things and I'm just in the world, I can quite easily write all day. When I'm still in the writing the plot, my brain gives out after about 4 hours.
Mm.
And I can keep writing, but very, very little happens. And when I'm in the editing stages, so either editing for myself before I give it to the publishers, um, or editing with the editor, I can. It's quite an intense period of a few months, and I will write all day, and I will often write all night as well, and I only sleep a few hours because I'm writing to a deadline. I'm a perfectionist, and I can't bear the thought of anything not being done that that I can do. So it's really polishing. But in the early stages, yeah, it's a lot of long walks and bike rides and banging my head against a brick wall and a lot of coffee, like just so much coffee. It's really embarrassing.
Well, do you read a lot when you're writing? And if so, what do you tend to read?
Yeah, I always read. I can't not read. But at different stages of the writing process, I have to read different books. So in the early plotting stages, I can't read crime. It's very, very hard for me to read crime, I should say. And at the very end stages, when I'm really polishing, I tend not to read crime fiction either. But in the middle, it's fine. So in those times when I can't read crime fiction, I will just read literary fiction, just straight, as little plot as possible,
Mhm.
just about language and poetry and character. Um, and so I guess, in the middle parts of the writing process, I will read anything, uh, except horror, because it scares me. And I know that's ridiculous because some of my writing is quite dark, but horror just scares scares the pants off. I can't do it.
I read tons of horror novels, so yeah.
Candace Fox is just so embarrassed, to even know me because she just loves watching and reading really, really dark things, and I don't want her to even mention them to me. I'm just no.
Fair enough. And we're rapidly closing in on the end of our time here, but I'm assuming that we have a lot of people in the audience who are working on novels. We know that we have a lot of aspiring writers in the Booktopia community. What's the best advice that you could give to an aspiring writer who wants to get started on their manuscript but doesn't quite know where to begin?
Mm. I think probably two things is one, think about why you want to write. So if it just feels like you should be writing, don't torture yourself. But if you really want to write, if you just think, yes, I want to do it, then just be honest about how hard it is. It takes a long time. And I think people often get disheartened because they write something and it's bad. All first drafts are bad. Your first drafts will get better as you go on. So just embrace the badness. Um, just go, it, it can only get better if you have written something. If you haven't sat down and written it, it can never get better. And I also teach clarinet. So I'm used to students being beginners and or even a little further down the track. And really the big difference between someone who goes on and becomes proficient, and those who give up, is routine. They sit down and they do the work. And whether that's every day or once a week or whatever the routine works for your lifestyle, it's having that routine. It just makes all the difference.
Fantastic. We've got a couple of questions from fans that have come through that we wanted to get your take on. So Kaz asks, how do you find the time to start writing a book?
Yeah. Again, it comes back to routine a little bit. And it comes back to also why you're writing. So if it's important to you, what are you willing to give up to write? And I don't mean that at all in a pejorative, you don't want it enough. I just mean if it's something that you want in your life, you will probably have to give something up. Whether that's a clean house or money because you're working less, or a Sunday brunch with your friends. But I think it definitely comes into the routine. If you know that you work or are a carer and you just don't have much time, and you go, but you know what, there's 3 hours on a Sunday where I usually go out with my mates or watch a film or something, that's the time, and and it's in your diary, and you just do it. I mean, and look, I know it can be really, really hard. I wrote my first couple of books when I literally had an hour and a half 2 times a week. And I did it because I wanted to do it. If it had been something I didn't like doing, obviously there's no way I would have gone through doing it.
I think in my experience, giving up a clean house and money is like just the bar for entry for working in the book industry. So,
well, I claim that my lack of clean house is because of the writing, but it's not.
That's an easy one to give up. And we've got one more question, which comes from Kiralee. She asks, do you plot out your whole storyline first, or do you start with an idea and see where it leads?
Yeah, well, as I was saying before, I very much start with some scenes. If I'm lucky, it's the first chapter, but often it's not. Often it's a third of the way into the book, and I want to know how the characters have got into that situation, and I want to know how they get out of it. So it's just about asking why, what happens next, and why, and just keep on going from that. But there's so many different ways of doing it, and some great books out there. Stephen King, his book on writing is really good. Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. Just really different techniques on how to write a book.
You should read more Stephen King.
I did. So here's the one from Pet Cemetery. I haven't slept since. I read it when I was
really?
like 12. I was just like, oh my God.
Oh, and we've had one more question come through actually just now. How long did it take you to write your first book?
All my life, I guess, is probably one of the answers. Resurrection Bay took probably about 5 years. It's hard to know exactly how long because I cannibalized some book of my first manuscript that I'd written, and I also didn't set a reminder on the calendar, but somewhere around 5 years. Yeah.
Wow. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Emma. We really appreciate you talking to all of us and sharing your insights. And to anybody out there who hasn't discovered Emma Viskic's wonderful books, including Resurrection Bay, you can buy all of the Caleb Zellick novels, except for book 4, which is not out yet, right now on booktopia.com.au. Thank you so much, Emma. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye, everyone.